Hi, my name is Stacey. I had a close friend with mental illness who passed away recently. Her name is Unique. This is a picture of us. Unique always talked about wanting to share her story, but she never really had the opportunity to do that, so I'm hoping to share at least part of her story for her, and also kind of the story of our friendship. So I met Unique when she was 15. I was one of her camp counselors, and somehow this friendly email after camp turned into 14 years and thousands of hours on the phone and this long-distance friendship that had more of an impact on my life than anything that I ever could have imagined. When I got to know Unique, she was living at home in a very difficult home situation and dealing with depression. And over the few years after that, I watched her go through the worsening depression, her first suicide attempt, multiple psych hospitalizations, and moving into foster care, and then a nursing home, and then eventually into the first of many group home placements. For the rest of her life after that, Unique just moved into a series of different group home placements all over the state. And because she had a physical disability but didn't have any cognitive disability, those placements meant that she was usually living with people who were much older than her and much lower functioning than her, which brought along its own set of challenges. For the first few years, Unique was pretty stable. Obviously, she had her ups and downs, but she did the best she could to make a life for herself and make the best of the situation. Eventually, things started to go downhill. The suicidal feelings came back. She had her first psych hospitalization in years, and that just started just a whole new period in her life, where for the next few years it was just a constant cycle of hospitalizations, dozens of them. She, at one point, kind of stopped making sense, had her first episode of psychosis, which lasted for a few months, and once she got through that and was back more of herself again, she had started to hear voices, and it was these constant, incessant voices that were shouting at her, all the reasons that she needed to kill herself and what a horrible person she was. And she was living in a really rural area at the time that didn't really have access to the supports that she needed. The staff didn't really know how to support her, and so just the hospitalizations kept continuing, and she really wanted to move, but it was hard for her to find someone who would help her start that process. So eventually I was able to help her find an advocate. She was able to move to an area closer to a city, and things got better for a while. She got some of her personality back. She tried to take some college classes, but then things started to go downhill again, and she ended up in a really deep depression. And I was getting these constant, 3 a.m. phone calls of her trying to deal with the suicidal thoughts, and the voices, again, screaming at her all those reasons that she needed to die, and she would just sob on the phone for hours, and the staff would never notice. And usually, eventually, I could get her to call one of the staff into the room, and then I could hear for myself the things that they were saying to her in the background, telling her, you need to stop saying things like that, you're going to scare people, or stop talking like that, you're going to go to hell, just read the Bible and you'll feel better, just go to sleep, you'll be fine in the morning, or my personal favorite at 2 a.m., you need to stop calling me in here, I have ironing to do. And somehow she kept fighting through all of that. I would always try to tell her that things would get better, and she would say she knew that things would get better, but then they would just get worse again. And she ended up being right, but she did keep fighting, which impressed me so much. Around that time, when she was already struggling so much, she found out that there had been some changes in the regulations about the kind of placement she was living in. And the fact that she had a typical IQ would disqualify her from that kind of placement, and she would have had to move to a nursing home. And she had been in a nursing home for a while when she was 18, and always said after that she would rather die than go back to a nursing home again. So she had some people fighting for her. There was a lawsuit filed on her behalf, trying to get her to be able to stay in that placement, but it was just way more stress than she could handle at that point. She kind of hit a breaking point. The voices got to be really overwhelming. She was having these constant, really intense flashbacks to abuse that she had experienced as a child, and she was having a really hard time figuring out what was real and what wasn't real. I was spending at that point up to 8 hours a day on the phone with her because she said it helped her to be less afraid of the voices. A lot of the time just listening to her cry and telling her that I loved her because there was nothing else that I could do. She knew that she was losing control and she was terrified. She begged for help from anybody that she could think of, but people just accused her of trying to get attention. And I tried to get help for her from anybody that I could think of, but everybody was just focused on the lawsuit and on her placement. So her worst fear, which was totally losing control, did play out at that point. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know what was happening around her. For a while, she just stopped talking completely. And then when she eventually did start talking again, her version of reality was very different than mine. So I still called her every few days during that time. I had made the decision that I was going to stick with her no matter what. So at first when she wasn't talking, it would just be, one-sided conversations to the sound of her breathing or the sound of her crying. And then when she started talking but was in kind of her own reality, it was trying to deal with that, where she could get really hurtful and really nasty and hang up on me a lot. And I had to try to figure out, that expression that's better to be kind than to be right, just to try to respond to the emotion of what she was saying and do whatever I could to keep the conversation going and hope that she knew that she was being supported and that she had someone that cared about her. It took a few years for her to get back to herself enough that she could have a regular conversation. And even at that point, it wasn't a total recovery. She still, if she got too stressed, she wasn't able to fight the voices as much, and they would kind of start taking over again. Her quality of life wasn't great at that point. She wasn't going to a day program anymore. She was in constant pain from back surgery that she'd had years ago, and she was just spending most of her time laying in bed. She would talk all the time about how she was just so tired of fighting and she just couldn't do it anymore. The last time that I visited her this past summer, she was just obviously so exhausted, physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted, and she just wanted me to sit there and hold her hand. So I did for hours. She did have some health problems, but nothing that should have been life-threatening, and there's a lot of indications that the stigma against mental illness and people's responses to her because of her mental illness played a role in her not being able to get the care that she received. So the other part of the story is my friendship with Unique and the impact that had on me. And it was easy for people to see how Unique benefited from the friendship. I was kind of that source of unconditional support for her, and for a long time, the only person in her life who wasn't paid to be there. But people couldn't figure out what I got out of the friendship, and people just assumed I must just feel bad for her. The reality is that I learned more and I grew more from my friendship with Unique than from any other experience I've ever had in my life. The biggest part of that, I think, was just learning to listen. I wouldn't say I was a great listener before I met Unique. There's that difference in listening to reply versus listening to understand, and she would accuse me all the time of lecturing her when I first met her. But what I eventually learned to do is to sit back and take myself out of the equation and just try to understand her experiences from her perspective, to be able to try to put myself in her skin and try to imagine what it would feel like to be living her life. And once I eventually was able to get to that point, it changed how I looked at everything and how I experienced everything and everyone in the world around me. And it had a huge impact. There are so many other things that I learned from my friendship with Unique. The importance of emotions, the value of emotions and sharing emotions, the importance of physical support and hugs and physical affection. I learned to be able to trust myself and rely on my instincts and not have to rely on other people for validation. And also I just learned how to be an advocate, how to speak up, and how to recognize that some things are too important to not be said. Before I met Unique, mental illness wasn't really a part of my life. Obviously, in the 14 years that I've known her, mental illness became a huge part of my everyday life. And for the past few years, with Unique's permission, I was sharing parts of her story on Facebook and at a few different conferences. And I started to see that no kidding Me Too phenomenon happening, where when I shared my story, other people started sharing their stories with me. People have things they want to say. Mental illness impacts all of our lives, but it's hard to start that conversation. And I also started to see the impact that being able to put a face on mental illness could have. As I shared Unique's story and people were able to have that personal connection, you start to see the stigma breaking down. It humanizes mental illness. Instead of that scary other, it makes it just another human being trying to get through life like all of us. And that's what we need to hear, not those sensationalized stories that the news shows us about mental illness, but just the real everyday stories of people living their lives with mental illness. Unique always talked about how she hoped that her story would be able to help people, and I know that it has. I hope that it will continue to help people. I think her life mattered, and her story matters, and the lives and the stories of everybody else living with mental illness matter too, and it's only by sharing those stories that we can fight stigma and make a difference.